Good day. Last 24 hours have produced little by way of news about the situation on the front lines in Ukraine, but lots of news about Russian missile strikes, which continue at the same high tempo as before across Ukraine. Now, a couple of days ago, during his press conference in Astana, Vladimir Putin made certain comments which some interpreted as meaning that the Russian missile strikes would soon reduce in number. There's absolutely no sign of that at the moment. The tempo of missile strikes has continued to remain at the same higher level that we saw starting on the 10th of October, shortly after the Crimean Bridge incident. And that reinforces my view that this is a sustained attempt not just to dismantle Ukraine's infrastructure, but to prepare for that major, much bigger strike that is due to come, on which John Helmer has talked about on the basis of information he's received from experts, which will once and for all knock out the energy infrastructure, Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure, most probably in correspondence with the ongoing, with the offensive, the military offensive, the ground forces offensive, which the Russians look like they're preparing to launch. Now, Zelensky himself has now issued statements to the effect that something like 30% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed. And of course, if this goes on at this rate for very much longer, then one assumes that the damage will achieve some sort of critical level beyond which repairs in any short period of time become increasingly difficult. But to repeat again, I still go along with Helmer's view. In fact, I definitely go along with Helmer's view that the purpose is not to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure at this time, but rather to weaken it, to detect its points of weakness, and then to deal the knockout blow when the ground offensive comes. Now, most of the attention has become increasingly focused on these Uranium-2 drones, these small micro kamikaze drones. Some suggested that they're better understood as miniature cruise missiles, propeller-driven cruise missiles made of plastic and fiberglass and such materials which are difficult for radar to detect and which seem to be doing so much damage, creating so much havoc across Ukraine's which seem to be posing such enormous challenges to Ukraine's air defense system. Now, I've discussed in various programs claims and counterclaims as to who designed and made these drones, and I've said that I can't myself judge on this. Most people, indeed most Russian commentators, take it as read that these are indeed Iranian drones. A few Russians, notably Andrei Martyanov, think that they're more likely that they are in fact Russian drones, Russian designed and built drones produced by the Zala Corporation, which, as I've said previously, is part of the Kalashnikov concern, which is also part of the giant Rostec conglomerate. Well, I'm not going to discuss this any further. Just, I will say this, the Iranians have consistently denied that they have supplied drones to Russia. They continue to make those denials. And over the last few hours, no less a person than Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, came forward and said that Russia, as far as he's aware, as far as the Kremlin is aware, is not using Iranian drones in this war. Now, some people are interpreting Peskov's words in a slightly sophistical way. They're suggesting that, if Russia has bought the drones from Iran, that they're no longer Iranian drones, they're Russian drones. I think Peskov intends people to understand him in a much more straightforward way. What he's basically saying is that any drones that have been used in Ukraine are Russian drones, Russian designed and Russian made, and they're not imported from Iran. Having said that, let me say again what I hope I've said before, the fact that the Iranians and that the Russians, including Peskov, are denying that these are drones imported from Iran doesn't make it so. Governments do lie from time to time. Certainly the Russian government has done so. Even Putin on occasion has done so. Not very often in my experience, but he has from time to time said, if not outright lies, sometimes he said considerably less than the truth. And I can believe that Peskov, for whatever reason, in obvious agreement on this point with Iran, is not being truthful when he gives the impression that these are drones that are designed and made in Russia rather than drones which were imported from Iran. I'm not, as I said here, to judge the truthfulness of Peskov's points. I'm not in a position to examine these drones or to come to any independent opinion about them. All I am doing is that I'm just informing all of you of Peskov's and of Russia's denials. In some ways, this whole topic is perhaps a bit of a distraction because regardless of where these drones come from, they're doing massive damage. And by the way, on this point, there is one further point of clarification which I think I can make about these drones. I've discussed in the past how they follow a pre-programmed flight path, that they don't, in other words, use sensors to identify the object that they're attacking, and that makes them all but impossible to jam. Now, a number of people have pointed out that is actually makes no sense at all, that given that these are very small and light drones with not very powerful engines, a brief gust of wind would cause them to deviate from their flight path. If it was entirely and exclusively pre-programmed in that way, then the vast majority of them would be missing their targets, when in fact, on the contrary, the vast majority of them appear to be hitting their targets. And that does suggest that they do have some kind of mechanism to identify the target that they're attacking and to keep themselves on path to attack their particular target, and that does imply that there are some sensors on these drones which could conceivably be jammed. I'm not going to comment further on this. That does seem convincing to me. Perhaps these drones are having a massive effect now, but perhaps as Ukraine develops countermeasures, imports jamming equipment from the United States, maybe their effectiveness will reduce. Though I suspect that there are always counters to whatever jamming techniques the Ukrainians might use, and of course it may be that the Russians have many more tricks in terms of drones up their sleeves. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. Clearly, a major missile and drone offensive against Ukraine, no sign of it slackening or easing off. By Zelensky's own admission, it's now doing serious damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. If it's sustained for much longer, that infrastructure could collapse, and that doesn't even take into account what Helmer believes and what I think Helmer is right about. The knockout, the really big punch, the really heavy knockout blow is still to come. So this clearly is having a major impact on events in Ukraine and over the course of the war. And on the battlefronts, so far, as of the time of making this video, no significant changes. We hear of reports of Ukrainian forces still trying to battle their way through to Svatove in the Kharkiv, northern Donbass region. There's apparently some kind of a tank battle there, which the Russians won, and the Ukrainians were driven back. At least that's what the Russians claim. In Kherson region, there's also been reports of Ukrainian probing attacks. Some people call them probing attacks, others call them attempted offensives. No progress up to this point on the part of Ukraine in that part of the front either. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of Kherson and what's going on there, I do want to, first of all, thank and also report certain corrections that have been made by members of the community to things I've said about the weather in Kherson. I've said in various reports that I understood that the weather in Kherson region had deteriorated, that there was rain and cloud, and that the ground was getting soft, and that this was affecting Ukrainian offensive operations in Kherson region. Now, several people have pointed out to me that this is actually wrong, that in fact the weather in Kherson region has been drier and presumably hotter in September and October than has been the case, usually the case, and that the rains, that the weather forecast is that the rains are due to begin on Friday of this week and haven't yet started, so that the ground is firmer and tracked vehicles can still operate across it. Well, I stand corrected, and I thank people who pointed that out to me. And that no doubt explains the attempted Ukrainian offensive of a few days ago in Kherson region, which, as I said, was a failure. And it may also, by the way, explain those reports in the Financial Times that there were expectations on the part of some people in the United States government that Kherson city might be captured by Ukraine this week. So it seems Ukraine is still able to carry out offensives. The weather doesn't prevent it doing so far in Kherson region, but all its attempts up to this point have been unsuccessful. Now, of course, if the clouds are indeed going to burst on Friday, if we're going to start getting downpours on Friday, if the ground is going to become much softer from Friday, then General Autumn will indeed have made his appearance in a big way in just a few days or hours. Today is Tuesday. It would leave only 2 more days of relatively good weather for Ukraine to achieve its breakthrough. Now, of course, I accept that it may take more than just a few days of rain for the ground to become really soft, and it may be that the time window for Ukraine is slightly bigger. But whatever, it does seem to me as if time is now running short. And perhaps the Ukrainians are going to try something. There's lots of reports from Russian telegram channels of Ukraine reinforcing a position here and sending more troops there, in and around Kherson region, and lots of suggestions that some kind of offensive is being prepared. But if the weather is indeed as much of a problem as has been said, and not just by Russian telegram channels, but by Western ones, then, as I said, the time window does seem to be running very short. And it's interesting that despite various Ukrainian attacks on various parts of the front line in Kherson region, we haven't seen anything yet that is really consistent with a big offensive to capture the city? Well, perhaps we'll see something like that over the next couple of days. I would also say that there is another possibility which perhaps hasn't been much talked about. Maybe Ukraine is calculating that the Russians are going to become complacent if the weather turns bad and will let their guards slip, and that despite bad weather and soft ground, Ukraine might be still planning during the late autumn some kind of offensive against Kherson region, perhaps using infantry, just ordinary soldiers marching towards Kherson. I have to say, I don't really think that's likely, but what do I know? As I said many times, I'm not a military expert, and I would be very surprised if the Russian command were taken by surprise by something like that. Anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians are able to do in Kherson region, and also in Zaporozhye, where I would have thought the same climatic conditions would be a similar problem. Every single Russian discussion of Ukrainian attacks on Zaporozhye region, this great offensive that the Ukrainians are supposed to launch from Zaporozhye city all the way to Melitopol to sever the land bridge between Russia and Crimea and between Russia and Kherson. All these discussions have all talked about Ukrainian amphibious landings at various points along the Dnieper River to outflank Russian forces defending their positions in Zaporozhye region. Now, whether such amphibious landings are really a practical option, I don't know, but I would have thought that if the weather really does turn bad, if we start getting rain and fog and all that kind of thing, then the chances of them being successful start to diminish substantially. Anyway, we will see what Ukraine does. At the moment, as I said, the front lines are stable. There was even, by the way, there have even been some reports whose truth I cannot corroborate, that one of the reasons that Ukrainian attacks towards Kherson city have not happened up to now and perhaps have been delayed is that because of heavy losses, some Ukrainian forces, some Ukrainian units have actually refused orders to attack. But this could be just Russian disinformation. But there have been things like that happen previously in the war. Who knows? What I would say is that the totality of events over the last few weeks, the failure to achieve breakthroughs, the fact that the Ukrainian offensive seems to be essentially at a standstill, the deteriorating weather, the increasingly critical missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, the inability of the Ukrainian air defense system to counter these missile and drone attacks, and the impression that Ukraine's Western allies are becoming increasingly distracted by their own internal problems and difficulties and are unable anyway to replace Ukraine's rapidly diminishing stock of ammunition and weapons with more ammunition and weapons, because Western stocks of ammunition and weapons are diminishing. All of these things taken together do indeed appear to be having, exactly as the Washington Post was reporting a few days ago, a bad effect on Ukrainian military morale, and I suspect not just Ukrainian military morale, but on Ukrainian civilian morale also. There's been, in fact, an extraordinary change in the mood as compared with 2 or 3 weeks ago. At that time, Ukraine was riding high. Its offensive was regaining ground. How important that ground was, another matter. How high the price for capturing that ground also was, that's another matter as well. The fact was Ukraine appeared to be advancing, and there was optimism on the part of the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian civilian population, that part of it which supports the war, and of course Ukraine's Western supporters. And now that things have changed, the mood has changed, and one is starting to get a mood of despondency, I think that's too strong a word, begin to settle in. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we're starting to hear the first murmurings in the West of the need to reopen negotiations. Now, this isn't just from people like Elon Musk. There was a very interesting article in Newsweek, of all places, by a journalist, by a venture capitalist and co-host of the All In podcast, David Sachs, who essentially called for a diplomatic solution to Ukraine's war, whilst admitting, by the way, that he is a friend of Elon Musk's. Title of this article, which appeared in Newsweek, as I say, is interesting. It says, "The neocons and the woke left are joining hands and leading us to woke war 3. Quite an extraordinary title, in my opinion, but anyway, he talks about, the article goes on at great length about how the West has got itself into a hole in Ukraine. Not everything in the article I agree with, but it did speak about the urgency of negotiations. The former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, has also written a very good piece on responsible statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, also calling for negotiations. Perhaps most remarkable of all, something which I have to say I did find a little unexpected, is that there's also been an article in the Financial Times saying that, diplomacy should go hand in hand with military support for Ukraine. It's not inappropriate or wrong to talk about diplomacy. And this article was written by Gideon Rachman, who is, as I know, somebody who is an absolutely stern, relentless critic of President Putin of Russia, and who has been absolutely stalwart in his support for Ukraine up till this point. And the title of that article is Diplomacy Should Not Be a Dirty Word in the Ukraine War. Far from being mutually exclusive, fighting and talking needs to happen at the same time. And having said that, I have to say that Rachman's idea of a settlement, of a potential settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, his idea of the kind of proposals that the West should be putting are of such a nature that I think that it is inconceivable that the Russians would accept them now. I mean, I'll just read out what they are. Russia must withdraw to at least where its forces were before the February 24th invasion. Ukraine must have its future as a viable state assured. Note the words viable state assured, with access to the sea, control over its own airspace, and reliable security guarantees that are not dependent on Russian good faith. And then the status of Crimea will be the most difficult issue in any negotiation. Admission, so far as I can see, that Crimea is indeed going to be lost to Ukraine. But the time when those kind of proposals would have been acceptable in Moscow seem to me long gone. And perhaps Gideon Rachman doesn't quite understand that. But of course, whilst these would have been proposals which the Russians would certainly have entertained before the war began, in fact, they're not so different essentially from what the original Minsk agreement pointed the way towards. The Minsk agreement, which of course Ukraine never implemented and which the West never backed, never persuaded Ukraine to implement. I think the time for proposals like this is now well past. Let me say again, the biggest event, the single most important thing that has happened over the course of the last week or so were Putin's words in Astana, where for the first time he seemed to leave open, in fact he did leave open, the possibility that at the end of this war, Ukraine as a state might cease to exist. Now, to be very clear, that is not Russian policy. The Russians are not yet saying that their policy is to destroy Ukraine as a state, to absorb Ukraine back into Russia, as it was for the previous 300 years. But we are now edging ever closer to that point. Some people seem to be picking that up. M.S. Badrakumar, the Indian diplomat, a brilliant commentator on geopolitical affairs, has written a fine article in which he appears to acknowledge that the situation is now such that it is indeed possible, likely even, that we could be seeing before very long a situation where Ukraine ceases to exist as a proper state. He's written for a newspaper, I believe it's an Indian newspaper, the Tribune, an article, a long article, a war Russia set to win, and in it he appears to arrive at the probability that at the end of this war there simply won't be any kind of Ukraine left, and at least that's how I understand the gist of his article. Now, as I said, I want to repeat again, this is not Russian policy. The Russians have not come out and said that they're seeking to destroy Ukraine. Officially, they're still willing to sit down and negotiate with Ukraine. The Russians receive a proposal from Kiev to sit down and negotiate, a proposal in which Ukraine recognizes that the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk, within their Soviet-drawn boundaries are now a part of Russia. Then the Russians will sit down and talk with the Ukrainians about that. They will obviously want other things. They will want guarantees that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. They will want assurances about the treatment of Russian speakers in what's left of Ukraine, in places like Odessa and Kharkiv. They will want the purging from Ukraine of the ideology of the 1940s that continues there. They will want Ukraine's demilitarization. But in that kind of situation, they would be prepared to talk. By the way, many people in Russia would at that point be extremely unhappy, and the various commentators, Russian commentators by the way, have mentioned on my local live streams that if the Russians did sit down and negotiate with Ukraine on that kind of basis, there might even be a political crisis in Russia. with many people very angry that Russia is negotiating with Ukraine at all. But all I am saying is that as of this moment, that still remains Russian policy. However, Putin has now said, not in so many words, but he has now said that whilst Russia had not intended in the past, when it started this military operation, to destroy Ukraine as a state, the actions of Ukraine and of the Western powers are making that now a real possibility. As has been pointed out to me, in effect, Putin was washing his hands of the whole affair. He was saying, if at the end of this, because of Ukrainian intransigence, because of Western intransigence, Ukraine disappears as a state, that will not be because I wanted it, it will not be because Russia wanted it, it will be because of events which were imposed upon us by others. Now that is a huge shift, and I don't think people in the West have quite grasped its full implications. Now I'm going to contrast what Putin said with the words of another Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, during the Second World War, who made comments about Germany which were sharply different from the ones about Ukraine that Putin has made now. And I'll read out this passage, and it was said, Stalin's passage from a speech Stalin made on the 23rd of February 1942, Red Army Day as I understand it. And by the way, a speech made very shortly after the Soviets had pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. So it's a time when the war is still in crisis. The very existence of the Soviet Union, of Russia, at that time was still in question. And you might think that in this atmosphere of crisis, the Soviet leadership, the Russian leadership, would be taking an implacable line against Germany. But this is what Stalin said, and I'm taking this, obviously this is a translation, and others can translate it in all sorts of different ways, but he says this: the foreign press sometimes carries reports that the Red Army pursues the aim of liquidating the German people and destroying the German state. This, of course, is a stupid lie and slander against the Red Army. The Red Army has not and cannot have such idiotic aims. And then he goes on to say that this is a war for the liberation of Soviet soil, and if it leads in the exile or destruction of the German leadership clique, we would welcome such an outcome. But it would be ludicrous to identify that clique with the German people and with the German state. The experience of history is that leaders, he means, of course, here, the German leader, he actually uses the name of the German leader, but because of YouTube sensitivities, I'm not mentioning it. The experience of history indicates that leaders come and go, but the German people and the German state remain. So Stalin in 1942 was talking about the continuation of the German state. It would have been open for Putin to make a similar statement. Stalin's words, by the way, from that speech are very well known in Russia today. He could have said something like that, but he chose not to. He didn't say that, the Zelensky clique, we'd be happy to see them go, but, people like Zelensky come and go. The Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian state remain. He didn't say that. He talked about the fact that in the past, the Russians had not had the intention of destroying Ukraine, but if it is destroyed, well, that's not down to them. It's a very significant shift, a major change in Russian thinking and Russian policy, or potential policy, depending on what happens over the next few weeks and months. Now, of course, I want to make it very clear that from a Russian perspective, Ukraine and Germany are profoundly different places. Ukraine, after all, was part of Russia for 300 years. There's massive interconnections and familial and other interlinks between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians don't think of Ukraine in the same way that they did about Germany in 1942 or indeed today. It is not a foreign country for them in the same way that Germany was and still is. So that explains some of the difference in attitude. But the fact is that, as I said, if Putin had wanted to say that he expected the Ukrainian state to continue, he could have said it, but he chose not to, leaving open the possibility that at the end of this war, it might disappear. Now, I have been talking for months about the importance of negotiations and of a diplomatic solution to this conflict. And I have also said that it is necessary to do that whilst there is still something of Ukraine left which can engage in such negotiations. Recently, at the time of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, I said that for Ukraine this might be a good moment for them to come forward and to start negotiations. They still had something to play for then, and they would be able to sit down and negotiate with the Russians from a position of, well, not perhaps strength exactly, but at least from a position of success. That opportunity, if it ever really existed, has been thrown away. Once again, events seem to be going against Ukraine. Maybe over the next few days they will be able to pluck something together, launch some kind of attack in Kherson region, push forward towards Svatova, do something like that. I have to say that's starting to look to me increasingly unlikely. But one way or the other, objectively, a leader in Zelensky's position, with a third of his energy infrastructure, by his account, already gone, with his allies in the West unable to provide him with the kind of air defenses he needs to counter this massive drone and missile offensive, with his soldiers, his army bogged down and unable to advance, with rumors that Ukraine might need another mobilization, which apparently those rumors are not being well received in Ukrainian society. Well, a leader in his position who really cares and has the interests of his country and his people ought to take heed of Putin's words and sit down and talk now, whilst the option of negotiation is still there, while that window of negotiation is still there. I wonder whether Putin's words in Astana weren't partly intended for people in Kiev, a reminder to them that their time window for negotiations is now closing, and closing fast. Well, for the moment, there is no sign of that at all. As I said, there are these mumbling words in the West now from people like Gideon Ratman about the need for diplomacy. And of course, we've also had that, more coherent words from people like Jack Matlock. Fine article by him, by the way. But as I said, time is now running very short. And we can see that the stakes for Ukraine are rising. It's the very survival of Ukraine as a state which is now at issue. Will Western leaders understand that? Will they grasp it in their own interests? I'm making this program at a time when all the consensus in Britain is that the British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, Prime Minister only in name, is probably hours away, perhaps days away from a resignation as a result of a political and economic crisis, which, as everybody knows but is too afraid to say, is directly related to the war. We see similar economic problems mounting in Europe. The energy minister of Qatar has now come forward and said that even if Europe can manage somehow to stagger through the winter, in 2023, the energy crisis in Europe is going to be far worse unless Russian gas starts flowing to Europe again. And we see also how the Russians are now talking about redirecting energy flows, gas flows from Germany to Turkey, putting Turkey, President Erdogan, in an exceptionally strong position as a transit, with Turkey as the transit state, in a position where he can turn off and on the tap and extract whatever concessions he chooses. Since I mentioned John Helmer earlier in the program, I'm going to mention him again. He's published a tweet in which he says that this is huge, this deal between Turkey and Russia about creating the Turkish gas hub, that it's huge, that it's a disaster for Germany and a catastrophe, by the way, for Greece and Cyprus. And as a Greek person, by the way, I agree. But there we go. Do people in the West understand this? Do they understand that time is running out? Running out for Ukraine, running out for the Western politicians who launched this policy, running out for the long-term interests of Europe? Well, I have to say, despite these mumbles about the need for diplomacy, I don't see anything like that yet. We still seem to be trapped within the hysteria that was launched in February, within this rage that we see in the United States and in parts of Europe against Russia. Rage, which I have to say I find both disturbing and irrational. We still seem to be trapped inside all of that. It's time that we started to look for a way out of that trap. As the British say, when in a hole, stop digging. We not only need to stop digging, we ought to start searching for a ladder, and we don't have much time left. Well, on that point, I'm going to stop this video today, and you can join me again for future programs on this channel. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and now Rofkin. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. We'll see whether anything happens, whether the Ukrainians do start any offensives in Kherson and in Zaporozhye or somewhere else before the weather really does close in on them. And we'll also see whether reason starts to dawn, if not in Kiev, at least in the West, as many are now urging, whether just possibly the next British Prime Minister might be who's surely coming fairly soon when Liz Truss leaves the picture, whether that person might rediscover the historic traditions of British foreign policy, pragmatic as they once were, a long time ago it must be said, and is able to put all the hysteria and anger to one side and see some sort of reasonable compromise. I have to say, nearly uttering those words makes me realise how fantastic that idea is. But heavens knows I live in Britain and one can always live in hope. Anyway, that's me for the day. More from me soon. As I said, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to the channel if you want to support this channel. And thank you once more and have a very good day.